All right. All right. So one thing I want to say is what's happening with the rest of this week. So as I said, last week we only had one recording, but this week what's going to happen is we're going to do today's class. Once today's class is over, I am going to we're going to see how far we get. And we'll see what we cover and what we don't cover. And then starting next class, or after this class is done, I'm then going to see where we are. And I'm going to either later today or tomorrow. Honestly, usually it would be later today, like on Tuesday. But today, because of yesterday being a holiday and some of my other sections got messed up, I'll probably record it tomorrow. And it will basically just be me continuing to lecture from where I finished today. And it's just going to be talking about the other reading, which was assigned for this week, which was the Noam Chomsky book review of something written by Skinner. And so what I will do with that is just give like the overview, very similar to regular lecturing. It's just you won't be talking to me. And if then what I'll do is post a question that's related to the reading or that assignment to the Blackboard, and then you will all have until Sunday to turn in like a little Blackboard. It won't be more than like a paragraph, just like, I haven't even come up with the question yet because I'm not sure where we're going to be, but it's going to be something pretty straightforward, not something worth stressing about. And as I said, this class is very much a, we're going to be trying out and experimenting a bit as the semester goes along. So if this first time I do this and it turns out that nobody likes the lecture videos with me just talking, we can try to find a way so that people could attend these, or we figure something out. But for now, just assume that it's going to be a YouTube video for you all to watch. Hopefully everyone, were there any problems with the YouTube, or did it work right and do what it was supposed to do? Okay, awesome. Yay, I'm getting halfway decent at YouTube. And I'm now up to like 60 subscribers. So yay, I've 40 more to go, and then I can change the name of the channel from like XJQV Blue R. And I think if I just get another like 90,940, I can start making money. So if you know several tens of thousands of friends you want to get to subscribe, we're good to go. All right, any last business questions? And again, I've got the chat up here, so if anyone wants to type in questions, I am looking at the chat in big font. All right, so let me erase this. So today's topic is going to be, I'll just write it down, Phi F. Skinner and behaviorism. So how many people, just out of curiosity, have heard of B.F. Skinner before in a psychology context? Raise your hands or do your little Zoom hands. Okay, so some people, a few of you have heard of him. I'm just trying to get a feel for how much I should assume that people have heard of him. And generally, what I want to do today is, because what's he most famous for in a psychology context? Does anyone know? Feel free to type or chat or shout. Yes, operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is, and we're going to talk about it later in class, but it's basically the way in which you train things to do what you want them to by giving them rewards and punishments. And so this is what he's most famous for, and he got famous for doing it in labs with rats and training them to do all sorts of things. But on that side is more Skinner, like the experimental psychologist who you're going to read about in your intro classes. And even if you don't, yeah, the Skinner box is the other one. And we're going to talk about Skinner boxes later. So those are the main contexts, are operant conditioning and Skinner boxes. But those views were fit into a much larger context. And what I want to do in this class is just explain like where his ideas, like why he was pushing for Skinner boxes, how he pushed, how operant conditioning fits into this bigger framework. And the way to think about it is, the way I want to approach it is starting by talking about an issue that came up last time when I, at the very start of class, asked what's psychology about? And we said it was a science. And then we ran into this issue. I can't remember who said it, but somebody said, one of my professors said it's the science of the mind. Another professor said it's the science of behavior. And I don't know what I'm supposed to think about this. And part of the reason that there's this difficulty of describing what psychology is there's this big push within psychology, amongst other people by Skinner, to argue that if we want a science with laws and regularities in the same way that you have with something like physics or chemistry, we can't talk about the mind at all. So the reason that you have to say psychology isn't the study of the mind is because there's nothing about a mind that's worth studying. And there's nothing that you can be scientific about the mind. The study of the mind is something you do in poetry class. If we're going to do a science, we need to talk about something that is, you can measure, something real. And so this is why a lot of people will say psychology, even though people say like there's psychology and it's the study of the mind or the science of the mind, there are a lot of people who do psychology who have argued that it can't be that because there is no mind to study in a scientific way. And Skinner's going to be one of the people here. And what we're going to do here is talk about how did, we all think we have minds. And these first couple classes are just going to be, what is psychology about? And we're going to look at two different viewpoints of psychology is not the study of the mind because minds don't exist. If you're going to do science, you got to get rid of talk of minds. And so what we're going to do in this class and the next one is talk about two major reasons that people have argued minds aren't real, minds aren't worth studying because you can't do science on them. And we're going to look at the arguments against that. And so just to put my cards on the table, I am someone who believes that there is a thing, the mind, that can be studied scientifically. And this is within cognitive science, which is a lot of the readings later in the semester. That's kind of taken for granted. And so what we're going to do at the start here is say, what is the evidence that people have, or what are some of the arguments people have given for there not being a mind? Let's respond to those so then when we move further into the semester, we can go, all right, we've already talked about why we should think that a mind isn't something like a unicorn that we want to believe, but there's no evidence for. So does this make sense? Just the big picture stuff. Nothing I've said so far, anything with the reading or anything like that. It's just big picture, general stuff. All right. So take a sip of coffee. All right. To get to Skinner, I want to do I'm a history person. I like history a lot, and I also am somebody who believes that you really can't understand ideas or people unless you understand the historical context in which they come from. And also, a lot of you are psychology majors who I'm not sure, I don't remember in my intro psychology course if they gave much of like a here's the history of psychology run through. And I kind of find this stuff interesting. If you don't really care about this stuff, you can tune out. But basically what I want to do is, how do we get to B.F. Skinner and behaviorism? Where did psychology come from? And so, as I said last class, psychology is this, like, we're interested in human minds, why humans do and think and feel as they do, which people have been interested in forever. But psychology as a field only started in like the late 1800s. Anyone have any idea why psychology started at about that time? There was one big breakthrough or one big theoretical change where suddenly there was this idea out there in the world and people were suddenly like, oh yeah, maybe we can study human minds using science. All right, let's see if I can get this another way. Okay, so the background is, for most of human history, and this is the thing about humans, we like to think we're special. We thought the earth was in the middle because we think we're special. We like to think of ourselves as different from all the other creatures. We are the special human creature. Starting in the mid-1850s, that was called into question. There was a big famous book that came out in 1859. Yeah, I just saw it in Eddie. So mind-body connection is tied into it, Cynthia, and dissection of bodies. The dissection of bodies is very closely associated, and this is also associated with the questioning of religion. Eddie.
Origins of Species, Charles Darwin.
Yeah, Charles Darwin's book came out in the 1850s. And Charles Darwin was the first person who was like, maybe human beings aren't that different from the other animals. And then all these people jumped on, because up to this point, everyone had said, humans are so different from animals. We can have science of animals. We can train them. We can do everything. But humans are special. We have souls. We're something different. Darwin comes along and says, well, maybe we're not all that different. Maybe everything about us can be explained in the same way as other animals. And people took this idea and ran with it. And we're like, all right, well, if that's the case, the human mind should be the study of science just as much as anything else is. And so people started making labs and decided to start doing science experiments on people's brains and trying to understand how the human mind works and find laws for it. And if you go back and read some of the earliest psychology stuff, it started mostly in Germany in the late 1800s. And you read some of these experiments, they're things that were very kind of, you look back on them and you're like, what exactly, how is this scientific? Because you think of science, you're supposed to, you're supposed to observe things, make predictions. Everyone remember that stupid class at the start of every single science in high school class where they go, let's talk about what the scientific method is, and then every single semester it's slightly different, and by the end you're like, what is the scientific method? But that's besides the point. There's supposed to be this way you look, you observe, you take notes, you make predictions of what it's going to mean. And so they started wanting to do this with psychology. And so does anyone know what the main method of early psych research was? Like what it consisted of? You bring someone into a room and you'd show them stuff and ask them how it made them feel. So you'd be like, here's a pencil. What does this make you feel? Or what colors do you see? Now, when you think about that color, if I show you something blue, how does that make you feel? What does blueness signal to you? Is this cold? Is this warm? And so you just end up with these huge books of people collecting information about what people's feelings are when you present them with things. And so this started off in Germany. It spread to the United States due to this guy whose name you don't have to remember, but it's Titchener for anyone who cares. And so there was this big push of just collecting data of what people feel, how you respond to different data. So everyone on board, we're in like the early 1900s. All of a sudden, there were a few Americans who came along who started going, all right, but what the hell's the point of any of this? What am I supposed to do if I know that you show them a blue square and they feel cold? Like, okay, so what? If I can tell you the rules of physics and why things fall, you can then build me a nice bridge, or you can make sure that you don't stand under a bowling ball that somebody's dropping. Like, these are things you can do with science. But this stuff where, like, you should give me a book of all the different feelings someone has when you show them a blue pencil. It's like, well, who gives a damn? So there started to be this push, and the name most associated with this early on was John B. Watson. That name might sound familiar to you psych majors. And his idea was, no, if we're going to do science, psychology is going to be a science, we need to get something out of it. We need to ensure that it's not just sitting alone in a room asking people how they feel about things. It's quite literally, we want some payoff. I want to know how to get people to do things, how to control people, help them succeed in life, and get the things they want. And knowing what someone hears and feels when they hear like a little bing doesn't really help. So there started to be this push in the like 1920s and 30s to have psychology do something. And this is where we're starting to get, and the other big issue with these sorts of views were, that people had issues with is how can you, like, what good is it to know that someone feels blue? What does that even mean? In science, you're supposed to be observing things. Like if you go into a chemistry lab, you take one chemical, you take another chemical, you mix them together and you observe them. There's not really any observing going on when you're asking someone to introspect and look at their feelings. So there was this feel of, if we're going to make science a study that's worthwhile, we need to start doing it in terms of ways that can be measured and felt and taken into a lab, and we can actually control variables and that sort of thing. All right, this is very general background of the history of psychology, of how leading up to around 1930, we end up with this push to start doing things in terms of observables and no longer just asking people how they feel, but starting to look for things that people can actually, write about in a lab setting. Does all this science, like just the history stuff, make sense? Again, if you zoned out, now come back to me. Are we doing all right? Yeah, so, I keep forgetting to look over here. But those of you who said introspection are 100% right. Introspection was the main way that these scientists were looking at how it was that the human mind worked. All right, so when people started, you can't see someone else introspecting, and a scientist is supposed to observe directly and make laws about it. So these people influenced, people like Watson and those influenced by him wanted something else for psychology to be about. If it's going to be the study of human beings and related to things that we traditionally say the human mind, what's an obvious candidate for the thing to be studied? What is the thing that you can actually watch and control and influence, and a scientist can sit there in a lab and actually write down? You don't have to ask someone else. You don't have to trust that they're telling you the truth. What can you actually write about and observe directly? Behavior, yes. Behavior is what they started to think. If we're going to have a science, and it's going to be in terms of laws, and it's going to be, if you do this, then this will happen because it follows this rule. the push started to be towards behavior. And so the focus in around the 1930s is people stopped going, let's worry about what happens when people are introspecting or feeling, and let's actually look at what people do and start trying to find the rules of what people do and control their behaviors. Because at the end of the day, what we really care about if we're trying to understand other humans is what they do. Like, I want to know, how do I stop someone from being an axe murderer? I want to know what caused them to commit this behavior. And if I see the behavior, I know what it is I'm trying to control, and I'm trying to look at ways of controlling that behavior. So that's the background of why we're having this shift to behavior. And now what I want to do is shift to Skinner. And Skinner's the person most closely associated with behaviorism, because for him, he came up with ideas, and this was in the reading that I gave you all, is it wasn't just for him that going about things in a behavioral manner was more useful and you could get something. He genuinely believed that if psychology is going to be a science, and there was a big thing because psychology was relatively new, whenever something new comes along, people want to like prove that it's worth studying. And so psychologists didn't just want to be, they wanted to show like, we have a purpose here and we're doing real science. We're not just making stuff up. We're not talking about unicorns. Like, we can do real science just as good as the physicists can, just as good as the biologists can. And so they wanted to say, we think that the way to do this is in terms of behavior. And what Skinner argued was it's not just that this is a useful way. It's the only way that you're going to get anything related to psychology to be a science that can be measured and controlled and be worth our time. So what Skinner did is kind of two parts. On part one, he said all the other things we might want to think of psychology as are wrong and flawed and bad. And the only good way of doing this is by trying to find the laws that govern behavior. And when we understand behavior, we can give complete descriptions of it without talking about minds, without talking about what's going on in your head. All it is talking about the environment and the environmental history that an organism was put in. And so just to frame what the rest of class is going to be, is we're going to look at why Skinner thought you could completely describe anything that you would want to describe in psychology without ever talking about minds. And so the background here is I want to talk about this, and I said this before, but it's worth saying again. We're going to talk about this because if we can show, or if we want to show that it is actually the mind is something worth studying, then we should show that you can't do anything like psychology without talking about minds. And so what that means is Skinner's one of the main people who said we can do psychology, we can understand, we can frame psychology just as the study of behavior, and we never have to talk about minds. And Skinner literally, he had this idea that you could do complete psychology and have a complete law-like description of human beings as a behaving organism. And then if you were to cut inside of an organism and look and see, and you found out inside all humans were empty, wouldn't matter, because for him, all that matters is the behavior. You don't have to know what's in the head. You definitely don't have to worry about what someone's thinking or feeling. Like, all of that is a waste of time. We look at what environment an organism is in, what it does, and that's how we find out. That's what we should be studying in psychology. And his belief was, we can get a complete science as good as physics, as good as chemistry, just by looking at behavior. And so his one side, as I said, is to throw away the other views, the ones that hold the mind as important. And then his second part of it is to say, and let me demonstrate to you that this is possible. I will show you cases in which you can 100% predict and control the behavior of an organism entirely based on things outside of its body. And that's where Skinner boxes and operant conditioning come in, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So is everyone on board with how this is fitting? That went a little bit fast, and so again, there are going to be times this semester in which I say bullshit, or I'm confusing. Just raise your hand and be like, Professor, you're making no sense. What that means is I did a bad job. It's nothing about you. Don't ever be embarrassed to ask a question. If you're confused, it's my fault. It's not your fault. So just wanted to say that. Now I need a little more coffee. All right, so that's the background with Skinner. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to turn to the reading. And the way to think of this reading is this is Skinner giving the background. This is part of a much larger book, and he wrote a whole bunch of books. But the idea was, with this book, or the chapter I gave you, is he's going to explain why So what I just told you all is kind of the background of why he started looking towards behavior. And now what we're going to look at is his explanation for why he thinks that you can explain behavior without ever talking about minds, without ever talking about feelings. All you need to talk about is the environment. And so that's what I want to do now, is kind of talk through what is his reasoning for this. So let me see, how do I want to do this? Does everyone have the reading handy, or should I screen share this? Okay, we've got the reading. All right, awesome. It seems like many of you have it, but if there are others, if you want me to screen share right now, just shout it in the chat and I can do that. Yes, all right, we will share. Give me 1 second to get to the correct page. The one problem with running on like 3 different screen share screen. Where's the one I want? Where are you? Firefox? No, you should be Chrome. Chrome should be here. Why aren't you letting me share my Chrome page? Okay, give me 1 second, everyone. I'm sure this is riveting. Whiteboard, no. Screen 1, no. Screen 2. All right. Is this showing up? Can people see this thing that I'm trying to share?
Yes.
Okay.
Professor.
Do you get to see yourselves too? Because I can try to make you all go away. Yeah, all right. Let me get you all over here to the other screen. All right, there we go. So what I want to do now is just go through and talk about how is he making these arguments that we don't need to talk about minds. So here's the reading, and the first part is just kind of a little spiel about like background. Everyone starts chapters with like a little blah blah spiel. Also, if you want me to call on you right now, I'm going to need you to type in the chat, because now that I've moved to multiple screens, I can't see everyone's face. All right. All right. So in this first bit of the reading, he's talking about basically we're trying to, in a psychology, we want to understand why organisms do what they do. And what that means is that we're going to try to understand the causes of behavior, because it's behavior that is what we're going to be interested in. And so what he starts off with is, how are we to explain behaviors? And basically what he does for this first bit is he talks about ways in which people have tried to explain behaviors before, and why all of these ways are wrong. And so he starts off with this some popular causes of behavior. So what are some of the ways, you can either read this on the screen or read it in your own, what are some of the ways in which he says, like, initially, these are ways that someone might try to explain our behavior, and these are the wrong ways. And eventually what he's going to argue is we're going to study behavior in a way that is only concerned with things you can observe in the environment. So what are some of the things he first throws out? This is just a reading comprehension little section. Give you a clue, it's kind of written on here. Yeah. Good, Steph. Astrology. He starts off by saying, when we try to explain why humans do things, very often we don't understand what's going on. And we start off by coming up with these things which we now look back on as kind of, quaint or cute. Now, I'm sorry, yeah, another one is physique. So basically what he says is, across time, people have tried to explain things in terms of like, why is this person grumpy? Well, they were born when Jupiter was in whatever, or Mercury's in retrograde. I have no idea what that means, but it seems like it's the explanation for everything on the internet these days. So the idea is supposed to be, people in the old days tried to explain human behavior in terms of things like astrology. And why did he say, what are the issues with something like astrology? Or what's the issue with trying to explain things in terms of the way someone looks? So another one he gives a little further down is that he says, people try to say that somebody's jolly because they're fat or something like that. There's this stereotype of like Santa Claus is fat, Santa Claus is jolly. And he says in the same way, people try to explain that people are aggressive because when they were born, Mercury was in the third orbit of whatever, yada, yada. What is his reasoning behind these not being useful ways of describing human behavior? Yeah, thank you, Ray. So they can't be, one thing is they can't be disproved. So like if I tell you that, the reason that I'm grumpy is that I'm a Taurus, or like the reason I'm whatever, how would you go about disproving that? There's no way of showing that I'm wrong. Just about everyone is like, oh, yeah, that could be true. Like you can't like go back and like change what year I was born. And Eddie's also right. It's too vague. Another thing is, I mean, anyone who's ever read your horoscope, what is the number one thing that horoscopes do? They talk in really vague terms. So you come across a horoscope, it's usually something like something good's gonna happen and something bad's gonna happen to you sometime in the future. It's like, okay, well, that's true for everybody. It's never like tomorrow your friend George is gonna stab you in the back with like a 4-inch blade. Like they're never that specific. They're very, very general. And because of this, you can't really disprove these sorts of things. And because of this also, they don't actually give you that much predictive power. If you know something good's going to happen to you in the future, like, okay, what are you going to do about it? You don't know what that good thing's like. You don't know how it's going to work. The other thing is, in his example of the fat man and being jolly, he says, all right, say it's, for one thing, we don't know if being fat and being jolly have anything to do with each other. We'd have to go out there and, measure a lot of overweight people and a lot of jolly people and see if there's any correlation between them. But even if there is a correlation that you can observe, that doesn't do anything. Because, well, what are some reasons that somebody who's overweight might be jolly? Is it that their weight causes their jolliness? What are some other possibilities? And why on earth would there be this causal connection? Anyone have any ideas? And there's not a wrong answer here. There's like a million different, part of the thing I want to say here is there's a million different equally reasonable hypotheses. Yeah, maybe it's that somebody who is fat because they are jolly because they like to eat so much that it leads to excessive weight. Another one is that this person's incredibly, because they're overweight and there's a stigma in our society about being overweight, maybe it's that they have to pretend to be happier than they are to be taken seriously. There are many, many different answers. So being told someone's jolly because they're fat isn't the sort of thing you can do in science. Remember, in science, what you're trying to do is come up with laws and predictions, and you want to know why people do what they do. So if psychology is going to be a science, you need to explain how things are the way they are. And he says that, the old-fashioned ways of, asking the gods or going to astrology or coming up with these ordinary, like, what is someone's body like? Do people know what phrenology is? This was a famous one in, I want to say, the 1800s. Are people familiar with this term? PHR. Let me write it down. I forget I have a board sometimes. How many people have heard of this term? Okay, so what is it? Does anyone know?
If I remember correctly, is it this like skull science?
Yeah, it was basically the way they predicted what people were going to be like. They took your brain and like felt the lumps. It was like, well, if you have a lump here, you're going to get really happy. And yeah, exactly. Kaywen, you're right. It's a fake science. It didn't actually have predictive power. And so what these sorts of fake sciences, what separates a fake science like this from a real science like physics or biology is physics and biology, you actually know things. Like you can go into a physics class and mathematically see at what speed this will drop at any given time. You can explain what the comparison, like if I went to the moon instead of on Earth, how would the dropping be affected? Something like phrenology or something like astrology doesn't have that level of scientific rigor. And so the way that Skinner starts this off is saying, if we're trying to come up with a science of psychology, which has to look at human behavior, because that's the only thing we can observe and study, then we need to start by looking at things that aren't like phrenology. And Eddie, yes, I think phrenology early on, and you actually, if you go back to the late 1800s, a lot of things which were called science are now we look back on, and they were basically ways in which, like, for lack of a better term, white people justified why white people were the best. So if you read this like racial theory stuff from the like late 1800s, it's just a bunch of crap in which white people are trying to justify their reasoning for thinking white people are the best people. And so, for instance, like the phrase Caucasian. Does anyone know why whiteness is called Caucasian? It's one of the more screwed up reasons ever. It's supposed to be like this scientific thing, whiteness. The reason why it's called Caucasian is the person who was like doing this pseudoscience and decided to divide everyone up into races for no good reason, thought people from the Caucasus region of like the border of Asia and Europe, so we're talking like Armenia, Georgia, he thought those were the prettiest people in the world. So he just decided that we call all white people named after the prettiest ones, which is, you know, a very scientific way of deciding. So if you ever have somebody who's trying to tell you about anything race science and what, just walk away. They're full of crap because there's nothing there. I'm sure most of you know that already, but again, in these day and ages when everyone's talking about things race related, in terms of, you know, this race is better than that race, it helps you just walk away. All right, so he throws out things like astrology, phrenology, and then what ends up happening is he says, all right, now what about the other main way that people try to explain behavior? These days, if I tell you I went to the store to buy a sandwich, what sorts of explanations might you try to give? Why did I go to the store to buy a sandwich? I like it. That's one, so I like it. I'm hungry and I like sandwiches. This is your everyday explanation for why I go to the store to get a sandwich. Things like, I'm hungry. I like / want a sandwich. Now, this is where we're really getting into the meat of Skinner. Because you're hungry, you want food for later, you're bored, you get it for someone else, you want to make a fort out of sandwiches. Eddie, these are all great ones. Nadia, another good one. I like the deli guy and I think he's cute. Yeah, these are all reasons you might like it. Oh, thank you, Ray. You can't see the board while I'm sharing. Thank you. I'll tell you what's up here. I'm hungry, I like / want a sandwich. Where's speaker view now? How do I get back to speaker view? Oh, I think it's down here. Let's stop the share. We don't need to share anymore. All right. Are we back to better? We doing better? All right. Sorry about that. Again, I'm still getting used to doing this Zoom thing, and having multiple screens is something I'm not used to. Oh, Nafis, thank you. Everyone can go to speaker view themselves if they want to see both. So that's just more Zoom stuff. But anyway, yeah, these are the sorts of explanations you want to give. These are the things people typically give. What does Skinner say about these responses? And this is once you get down a little further in the reason, or in the reading. What does he think about these? Does he think these explanations are more like science, or are these more like astrology, more like phrenology, more like just blaming it on the unicorns and the witches? I'm trying to stack the deck here. All right, so first off, I asked that question incredibly poorly, so the fact that you didn't answer is a sign of me, not you all. But anyway, what Skinner says is he wants to say, this is the way we typically do this sort of stuff. This is just as wrong as describing things in terms of the universe, or in terms of the stars in astrology, or in terms of your weight. He says that saying you're hungry, you want a sandwich, you like someone, that is not science. Science needs to be rigorous, and you need to be able to observe. And so, why does he say that these sorts of explanations are no good? Why does he say it's no good to say you're hungry? Why does he say it's no good to say the reason you did it is you wanted a sandwich? So yeah, Ray, the one thing for sure is in a lab, remember, you're trying to explain and control another's behavior. How many of you can see my hunger right now? Describe what it looks like. Yeah, Cynthia, so you can't actually see my hunger. All you see is me act on my hunger. If you know I'm hungry because you see me eating a sandwich, and after the fact you say something like, oh, he ate a sandwich, therefore he must have been hungry. But in terms of my inner state, you can't see it. You can't observe it. So if you want this to be a science, according to Skinner, we have to throw out this talk of being hungry or the mind. Usually he says what happens is when we say things like, you say, why did that person forget? Well, it slipped their mind. Or why did this person misspeak? Well, their tongue got twisted. He says all you're doing is just giving another label to the exact same thing. To say I would like a sandwich or I think the person at the deli is cute, all I'm saying is I want to be around that person and aim my head at them. Now, wanting to be around, or I am likely to get near a person and turn my head so that they are within my 45 degrees. He says this is something which is worthy of a science because you can measure this. You can measure what someone is looking at. You can measure where they are. You can observe these things. You can't get inside their head and see whether they like sandwiches or not. That's not the sort of thing that science should be studying. This sort of stuff should get thrown out with the astrology. It should get thrown out with the phrenology. All of it's got to go. If we want psychology to be a science, we need to look at human behaviors described in a different way. We need to forget about what's going on in the head and look at things that are observed and see the way the observable external environment controls behavior. And so this is up in the reading about till halfway through. Up till this point, what he's been doing is saying, look, these are ways people have tried to explain behavior before, and they're all crap. We need to throw them all out. We need to get rid of all talk of astrology, and we need to get rid of talk of minds and beliefs and hunger and anything like that. Because any time that we're talking about something like hungry, we can redescribe it all perfectly just in terms of what an organism does and what its history is like. So here's the big, just to take a big picture stand back. What Skinner's trying to say is psychology should not be done in terms of minds. It's done in terms of behaviors, and it's done specifically in terms of the environmental effects on behavior. And he's saying that if you want to, we shouldn't have a class called philosophy of psychology. It should just be a class called the study of human behavior. And what he's going to then show is he thinks that this first thing that he does is argue all these old ways of doing it in terms of beliefs, desires, all that stuff doesn't give you any scientific explanation. What does is looking at the individual organism's history and looking at what environment they're in right now. And so there's this 1-2 punch sort of thing. First he says, here's the negative. This is why the old ways won't work. And here now I'm going to prove why you can do it all in terms of facts about the environment and facts about the history of this organism. So is everyone, this is a good place to pause of how the parts are fitting together. The main, just to highlight again, the main point of what we've talked about so far is to say why this guy, B.F. Skinner, thinks we don't need to talk about minds in psychology. And his reasoning is you can do all this stuff in a better, first off, things like talking about I'm hungry, it's not buying you anything. All you're saying when you say someone's hungry is they're likely to go seek out some food right now and stuff it in their face. That's all to say I'm hungry is. Or you say someone likes someone else. All you say is they're going to put themselves in a situation in which they're in that other person's company. And there's nothing more than that. And he says, in fact, now what I'm going to show you is that we can actually come up with something scientific that can be measured and observed and explain behavior a lot better than this crap can. And it's all going to be described in terms of facts about the environment and facts about what happened to this organism earlier in your life. So is everyone on board? We doing okay? All right. So this is where we're going to get into the other part of Skinner that we talked about. So this is his theoretical background as a theorist. Now what I'm going to do is talk about his second side, which is why he believed that you could explain all behavior in terms of environment conditions and individual organisms' personal history. And the way he did this is he found some behaviors and showed that you could come up with law-like generalizations to explain what an organism's about to do, and you could do it entirely on the basis of what that organism finds itself, like what situation it's in now and what situations it's been in the past, and you don't have to talk about anything else. And this is where operant conditioning and his famous Skinner box comes in. So let's talk about Skinner boxes. What was a Skinner box? Anyone know? And I can see you all again, so if you want to talk, you can talk now. I'm going to start by drawing a box. See how this goes. Yeah, rat press button. That is a very good description of a Skinner box. So here's the basic idea. This is a terrible box, but we're going to go with it. So imagine that here's a box. In this box, you've got a little bar. And this little bar is connected to a little tray. And in the background, there's a little thing of food. Food. Now, what goes into the box? If you're running a Ray, you're correct. So what goes in? Yeah, so you put in the box, you put a little rat. Let's see if I can draw. That's my rat. So you put a rat in a box. What's the rat going to do? First time you put it in a box.
It's gonna like figure out where the food is at.
So it's just gonna sniff around at first. It's gonna try to figure out, like, if you were a rat in a box, you're just gonna walk around and you're just gonna, like, you know. And one thing to be clear is, for Skinner, you can't describe this in terms of mind. Remember, we can't talk about minds or anything other than just what this rat's doing. So you could describe, in this case, rat will walk around. Eventually, what's gonna happen? The rat's going to press every single corner, and in the process, it's going to lean on this little bar. And what happens when it leans on the bar? Well, the way the box was set up, a little electrical current connects, and a little piece of food comes out. So the rat now presses the bar, food comes out. What's it going to do? It's going to eat the food. Now, here's a fun fact. Just like us, rats like food. So now the rat, it's going to be startled. It's going to jump and go, oh, and then it's going to notice there's food. It's going to eat it. Now what's going to happen? The rat has pressed the bar and gotten one piece of food. What happens next? It's still in the cage. Things are still the same. Yeah, the rat's going to eventually press the bar again. And what's going to happen? It's going to get more food. And it's going to get more food, and it's going to get more food. And eventually what ends up happening? What does the rat end up doing? Has anyone ever seen what these videos look like? You end up with a rat that just sits there. Like, if here's the bar, it's just going like this. And the rat will just sit there pounding the bar, getting food over and over and over and over again. Now, what Skinner says is you can describe what just happened here without ever discuss. So, like, now imagine you take the rat out, you take it away. It goes to sleep, whatever. You bring it back 5 hours later. What's the rat going to do? 5 hours later, same rat.
Run like immediately towards the bar.
Yeah, it's going to run immediately towards the bar, and once it gets to the bar, it's going to press it over and over and over and over again. And what Skinner says is, now you can describe what this rat is doing and give a complete, full, accurate description of the rat without ever saying what's going on in the rat's head. All you have to do is describe what the environment the rat is in is like and what environments the rat has been in before. You don't talk about what the rat's feelings are. You don't need to say the rat's hungry. All you describe is this rat has been in a box like this, in which every previous time it's pressed the bar, it's gotten food. Therefore, you know with almost 100% certainty, this rat will immediately go and press the bar again. And so what Skinner wants to say is, this is like an example of the way in which you can describe a behavior of an organism without ever having to know what's going on in its head. All you do is describe its behaviors, or all you do is describe the conditions it's been in before and what its rewards and punishments were for that behavior. And if you know all that, you can predict this organism without ever describing its mind, its feelings, anything. And this, according to Skinner, was completely scientific. And the idea is, he started with rats because they're simple. He moved on to pigeons. And what he found was, that he argued every bit of an organism's behavior could be explained in this exact same way. The idea was you start here and you just build upwards. So you start off with a reward system where every single time it presses, it gets food. So how could you change this up? What situation, how might you do this setup differently? And how might that affect the behavior? And what he did was he observed certain sorts of effects have certain sorts of certain sorts of changes in the environment have certain sorts of effect on the organism. So yeah, any behavior that's rewarded is going to be repeated more often. So, you know, if you get a piece of food when you press the bar, you're gonna press the bar again. Imagine a slightly different one. Imagine the moment the rat presses the bar, it gets an electric shock. What's the rat gonna do?
It's kind of like a sort of a punishment, so the rat's not gonna like press the bar again.
Yeah, the rat is never going to ever press the bar again. And Ray, I'm going to come back because this is a really good point. What Ray said in chat is you can't explain reward or punishment without assuming it enjoys the reward and hates the punishment. So I'm going to come back to this in a second because Skinner is going to, I think, just to be clear, I think this is a really great point. That the whole system, it seems like you can explain it. It feels like you need to talk about wants and desires to explain the organism's behavior. But Skinner thinks something else. But I want to finish off talking about this, and then I'm going to come back to this point, Ray. So, yeah, if you electrocute it, it's going to never press the button again. And here's an interesting thing. If you, like, in the actual experiments they did, they shined a light one time, and by shining the light one time and then electrocuting the rat, any time for the rest of the rat's life that a light went off, it would run like hell. It took one trial. And this is the same thing with human beings. How many of you have had a food that you ate and then you threw up? How many of us have had this? Raise them up. Yeah, everybody's had this. For me, it used to be baby carrots. I ate baby carrots once when I was like 7 and I puked everywhere. It was totally unconnected to the carrots. But for the next like 10 years, I could not eat a carrot. Why? It only took one. And this is classical sort of like, I ate carrot, I ate it one time, and I'm never going to do it again. And so, Daniel, this is tied in 100% with classical conditioning, which I'm not going to talk about just because it's going to take us to another side. But this is basically, the idea is what has happened in your history explains now to a perfect explanation. So Eddie says Outback Steakhouse, trash. I now know from that, probably because he threw up from Outback Steakhouse, I can predict with 100% certainty that if we were all hanging out in person and COVID was over, and I suggested, let's all go to a restaurant, Eddie is not going to suggest Outback Steakhouse. I don't need to know what's going on in his head. All I need to know is that he has had a time in which he threw up at Outback Steakhouse. He will never eat there again. That is something I know, and I don't need to talk about what he likes or desires. Quinoa, another good one. I can know now that Cynthia's never going to eat quinoa. Like, I don't need to know that whether she likes it, whether she's hungry. I just know she threw up once, quinoa out. So the idea, and this goes back to Ray's point, how do you make sense of reward or punishment if you don't talk in terms of what the organism likes or dislikes? And the way that Skinner says, no, we don't need to talk about likes and dislikes. All you have to say is, does this increase the probability that that organism will go back for that activity in the future? So for Skinner, the only thing you define as a reward, to be a reward is just to increase the likelihood of a behavior in the future, and to be a punishment is to decrease the likelihood in the future. So his idea is that every single human behavior is to be explained in terms of operant conditioning. Everything you do is explained in terms of operant conditioning. And so we don't need to worry about minds. We don't need to worry about anything. In psychology, and he started with rats, but his idea is you start simple, and if we can prove it works in the simple case, let's just get a little more complicated, and we'll keep working out and showing that everything a human being does can be explained as if we were a rat in a Skinner box. It's just a little more complicated because we're out in the real world. But it's very easy to come up with cases in everyday life that it seems like the explanation you give can be 100% accurate, and you do it in like an operant conditioning or Skinner box sort of way. So, Cynthia asks, can this theory explain, or why with this theory, can you explain why people eat poorly? So yeah, so what you can do in this sort of case is people, and by poorly here, I think we mean eating unhealthily, right? Okay, so the idea would be, why is it that somebody eats way too many potato chips? Well, what Skinner's gonna say is, explain to me what they've done in the past. And you say, well, when they were little, they were given a potato chip, and then they ate the potato chip. And they ate the potato chip, and after eating that potato chip, they sought out another potato chip. And there was a, you want to say something like it was a pleasurable sensation, but what he would say is something along the lines of, there was something about that act of eating the potato chip that makes it more likely that they're going to seek out a potato chip in the future. And over time, because every time they've eaten the potato chip, they seek out and behave in a way that makes them want another potato chip, it's a reinforcing sort of thing. So you reach for it, you eat. You reach for it, you eat. And over time, there's no sort of punishment that's just making this person not want that potato chip. What ends up happening is, like, if you want them to stop, you could, in theory, like, electrocute them when they went to grab a potato chip. So, like, they go for it, and they then reach for it. Or what happens when somebody who's eaten like crap their whole life suddenly stops eating like crap? Well, what ends up happening is somebody comes along and says, I don't like the way you look. Or somebody comes along and stops wanting to be their friend. Now, this acts as a punishment for that sort of behavior. And so Skinner's going to say the reason why people eat unhealthily is the act itself is just an act which by itself increases the likelihood someone's going to do it again, until there's a time in which there's an external punishment for following that sort of behavior. Now, I think that, Cynthia, I do think that this is a good example, because it's really, really hard to explain why this person does it without liking the taste of potato chips. And once you do that, you kind of get outside the Skinner loop. But Skinner would want to argue that everything, like, we don't need to talk about likes. It's just there's something about a potato chip that makes it more likely that people are going to grab another potato chip. And it kind of is like that. Like, you know, have one potato chip, and it is very hard to, like, stop. Like, it's very, very tough, or if you eat one, to stop at one. Yeah, any sort of crunchy stuff. As soon as you eat a piece of crunchy, like, I feel like Doritos are my killer. Like, I will eat one Dorito. There's no way a human being can. If you are somebody who's eaten one Dorito ever, like, you are a true saint of a human being, and I don't understand how you can stop at one. I can stop sometimes at 1 to 2 bags. Like, that's an accomplishment. But yeah, so he wants to say that this is what's going on. And the interesting thing is, you can look at behaviors in human life and, like, look at actual more complex human behaviors and start to see why it is that somebody's behaving in that way, and give a Skinnerian reward and punishment sort of system to it. So, for instance, a child. Think of a little kid. We'll start with kids, then we'll move to adults. With a child, this child walks into the grocery store and starts screaming, I want candy! I want candy! Why is this child screaming, I want candy? Why aren't they just politely tapping mom on the shoulder and saying, hello, mother, could I please have some candy? Why is the kid screaming? What is a good explanation for why this kid has started screaming?
To grab, like, attention?
Yeah, to grab attention. And very likely, this is a child who in the past started screaming really, really loud, and their parents eventually gave in to, yeah, Alan, in the past, this child screamed loudly. The child's parents then gave it candy. Because it screamed loudly and got candy, it learns through this conditioning system, like, oh, if I want candy, I'm going to scream again. So over time, this child was rewarded for screaming. If you want a child, if any of you are parents and your child starts screaming for candy and you want it to stop screaming for candy and never do it again, what do?
I don't know, like, smack them?
So smack them,
At home, I don't know.
that's one way you could do it, but that has a lot of downstream effects. Like, if you smack a kid when it asks for candy, it then, like, hitting children in general has some strange psychological impacts on them. So I don't recommend hitting the children, but the main thing you do is you just ignore the kid. If you ignore them, eventually they're going to, give out. Also, think of the class clown in high school, or the person who wouldn't shut up in class. What's the best thing to do to get the class clown to be quiet? Like the teacher, what's the worst thing the teacher can do? If you've got someone who's in the front, like goofing off and everyone's laughing at them, what's the worst thing the teacher can do?
Give them attention.
Give them attention, exactly. If you give this person attention, they're seeking attention. So if you give them that attention, you're rewarding them. You're saying, hey, you who's acting like an asshole, I'm now going to reward you by giving you the attention you desire. And the teacher might not think about this, but they might think like, I'm gonna yell at them, I'm gonna punish them. But to the student, it's like, oh yeah, now I'm the center of attention, that's what I wanted. The best thing a teacher can do is just be like, all right, please exit the room quietly, or just ignore them. Another thing, like here's a classic one. You will notice in this class, over the course of this period, I have gotten more energetic. There's two reasons for this. One of them is I drank more coffee, but that's a separate physiological one. The other one is as I've gotten into it, every time I've said something mildly funny, at least one of you that I can see has smiled. And when you smile, I'm programmed as a human being to get a little excitement out of that, and then I want to do it again, and I want to do it. And so over time, I end up giving you all, like you are my reward system for behaving in this way. So you can even take complex adult behaviors and kind of shape how they do it. Another one is, say you've got a significant other or a partner or someone, they come in a clothing item, which you think is really, really nice. And you think they look great in it, and you would love in the future to see them wearing a clothing item like this again. What do? You compliment them. Yeah, you say, that looks great. That looks superb. If you don't ever want them to wear it again, what do? Yeah, you say ew, or you just go, ah, yes, that is a thing a person could buy, I guess. Or that's one way to spend your money. Or shouldn't you have done something else with that cash? Or why were you on Instagram? Or yeah, insult them. You look terrible right now. These are ways. And why does this work? It shifts people's behaviors. It makes people, you gave them this, and then in the future, yeah, return it, please. Any of these sorts of things are going to make it less likely that they buy it in the future. And it seems like this is just human beings in a Skinner box. Why do you do this? Well, somebody came along and told you don't do it. You can think, why do fashion trends catch on? Why is it that, like, why are bell bottoms out right now? Or maybe they're coming out. I'm terrible at fashion. I come up with examples, but then like I never know whether it's true. But like if I were to, I guess here's a good one. If I were to show up to this class in jorts, like jorts and a wife beater, like what is the response going to be of my students? What would you like if you have you ever had a teacher show up in jorts? Everyone know what I mean by jorts? Also, all right, jean shorts, like cut off jean shorts that are like this long. Like if I showed up in that and just like a really skinny, like little tank top, yeah. Some people are gonna be like you're gonna not take me as seriously. I'm gonna see those faces, and those are gonna act as a punishment for me and get me not to wear them again. If, however, I wear something and everyone's focused on me that class, then I'm going to want to do that again. And in this way, my environment is going to shape how I behave, what I think. And so Skinner's saying, look, we can give a complete explanation. You might ask me something like, why are you wearing that collared shirt today? And somebody's going to want to say, like, the traditional explanation would be something like, I think the professor wore a collared shirt because he thought it looked nice. Or he believed that no one would laugh at him, or he believed it was appropriate. What's Skinner going to say in this case? That's the wrong sort of explanation. The right sort of explanation is instead going to be that the reason the professor's wearing a collared shirt is because up to this point, he's currently in an environment surrounded by students on a Zoom class. In the past, times in which he wore a collared shirt while teaching are ones in which the students paid attention. Times in which he wore a t-shirt when he was teaching are ones in which students paid less attention. Therefore, he, in his conditioning, was conditioned by the rewards and punishments such that he is now acting upon the behavior of wearing a collared shirt. And you can predict, based on my behaviors and the way you all behaved, that next time I will very likely wear a shirt with a collar on it. And the reason why you do this is you just say, it's just like a Skinner box. He may not have realized that he was pressing a bar, but when he put on that shirt and students paid attention, that was giving him rewards. That's what it was. Something about it was increasing the likelihood he's going to do it again. And that's all it is to do psychology, Skinner's idea is every single thing can be explained and trained in this way. And if you want somebody to do something, this is all you do. So for instance, all of you are, this works better if we're in person, but those of you who I can see, none of you are throwing things at the screen or flipping me off. Why are none of you throwing things at the screen or flipping me off? According to Skinner, what's the reasoning? It's not that you don't want to be mean. It's nothing like that. What's the reasoning you're not flipping me off?
You're actually enjoying the class.
So one could be that you're in, well, that is another reason that a person might give, but Skinner's going to say that's not right. And Eddie's saying, in the past, how many of you have flipped off somebody in your life? What was usually the response of you flipping someone off?
A negative reaction.
Yeah, you get a reaction, and generally it's not a positive reaction. It's generally they like try to fight you or they yell at you. Like if you do it in person, usually I feel like it's a common activity if two people are in cars, because that way you can't like physically fight each other. But if you've done it in the past and it led to a negative outcome, you're less likely to do it again. Especially because, you know, as a teacher, I have the power to punish you and by affecting your grade. And if you make it so that I don't like you, it's more likely that even if I'm not trying to, because I have been rewarded if I talk to you in a certain way, I get flipped off, I'm less likely to do that again. So I'll talk to you in a different way. So it all can just be explained in terms of Skinner boxes, rewards, and what's happened before. So you may have been in a situation similar to this in a certain way, and you may have flipped me off. Or flipped someone off, and that person was in a position of power. And because of this, you ended up being hurt. You might have made it so that something bad that you did not give you positive reinforcement happened. George, you have a hand.
I just forgot to put it down.
Oh, no worries. Again, if at any point anyone's got hands and you don't mean to, and I call on you, just, yeah, that's fine. Again, we're all learning Zoom. So the idea here, according to Skinner, is that everything can be explained in this way. And this is why psychology doesn't need to talk about minds. Now, if Skinner's right, then the rest of the semester is a waste of time. If every single behavior can be perfectly described in the same way as a rat in a box, then the issue is that we don't need to talk about beliefs, desires, minds, how the human mind works. It's all a waste of time. So this is why Skinner's worth talking about early on in the semester, because as a matter of fact, he was incredibly influential, especially in the 50s. And I mean, you talk about him in psychology because a lot of his principles are correct, like on a certain small scale way. Like Skinner box stuff does explain why human beings do things in certain ways. And if you want to train like an animal or a child, like how do you train a child? Like potty train a child is just classic Skinner operant conditioning. If the child pees in the toilet, you give it a treat. Like, here's a little, like, your favorite whatever it is you give to children. Here, child, here's your favorite thing. You peed in the toilet. Good job. If you want somebody to, you know, show up to class on time, one effective method is you just shame them if they're late. How does that work? Classic or operant conditioning of the Skinner type. So Skinner's uses these simple cases and says we can explain all human behavior and all animal behavior in the same way, and that's all we need to do. And so at the end of the day, Skinner's idea is this is it. This is all psychology is. If you know how a Skinner box works, we can explain every single behavior a human being can do. How do you explain why this person does a certain ballet? Well, the reason they're doing ballet is because of their history. We might not know the whole history, but if we could get the whole thing, we'd explain why they did this ballet completely, why they went into ballet, why this was the person they went with teaching, what rewards and punishments. Why are some of you psychology majors? It's not because you want to or you desired it. It's rather because at some point in your life, you were rewarded for moving in the direction of psychology, and you were punished for moving in another one. I mean, I'm sure many of you, if you were anything like me, when you were little, you wanted to be, say, a professional sports player. Somewhere along the line, you recognized that that wasn't going to cut it for you. And the way I found out is when I lost I came in like last in every race in high school. Once that happened, I kind of accepted I was never going to be a professional athlete. And like the shame of coming in last over and over again, that begins to let you know, like, that was my punishment. How did I end up teaching? Well, I got some rewards for it. And so the idea is everything, you don't have to talk about beliefs, desires, feelings. Everything is just, what was this environmental history like? What is happening to this organism now? So that's how Skinner gets here. And if Skinner was right, we would get rid of psychology as anything more than studying how you change behaviors in the environment. Of course, that's not what's happening in psychology. So does everyone understand like the general picture here of what Skinner was trying to say, why he was trying to say it, and more importantly, why we're starting the semester with it? It's basically to give us something to point to as we could be that way, but let's not be that way. And what I want to do, and what the next class, or by which I mean the next time when I YouTube lecture, either later today or tomorrow, is going to be talking about, so Ray, so Ray, just to highlight, he said, it does sound strange to him. You keep doing something because you're rewarded, but a reward is simply something that makes you keep doing it. It seems like you haven't actually explained anything. And that's spot on. I think that's one of the major issues with behaviorism, is that it doesn't seem like we've given we're just describing the data in perfectly accurate ways. Like, if this has happened in the past, this is going to happen in the future. And so to somebody who wants more explanation, this is a very unsatisfying situation. Now, what Skinner actually said is, we need to get rid of and this is, if you don't follow this right here, don't worry, it's not anything that's crucial. But according to Skinner, the reason that this isn't a problem is because we don't ever, like, cause and effect we get rid of it entirely. We don't need to try to get any explanation. There's nothing to explain here. It's all an illusion. And if you expect anything more than this happening, leading to a more likelihood of this happening, you're looking for something impossible. You're looking for magic. We can't find magic in the real world. All you can describe is the statistics of it. But if you're someone like Ray, or someone, to be honest, like me, you want to know, yeah, all right, so the rat is more likely to do this, but why? What is it that makes this a reward? This isn't any sort of explanation the way it was right here. So one thing that's an issue with Skinner is, at the end of the day, you don't actually gain that more than just a perfect description of the way things are happening. And if you're someone who wants to know why an organism is doing it, it seems like just describing the behaviors isn't enough. Another issue is, it seems like Skinner wants to say that you can perfectly describe why the rat does what it does in terms of behavioral rewards. But as Cynthia points out, it seems like there's going to be certain times in which there's a behavior that doesn't seem to line up perfectly with what's come in the past. Like, it's always possible that the rat just, like, doesn't go for it. And you're left wondering, like, why does the rat not go for that? It seems like there's still a little wiggle room. And what we're going to talk, or what I'm going to talk about, and what the Chomsky reading was about, with Chomsky's essentially going to say this, is like, even if we know the history of everything leading up to this point, there are certain behaviors that you cannot explain in a behaviorist way. And so you can imagine this rat not going for the reward. And Skinner's going to say, we can explain that perfectly well. But actually, it seems like there's certain behaviors that cannot be explained purely in terms of what rewards and punishments you went through in the past. And so, for those of you who have read the Chomsky reading already, or who are familiar with Chomsky, does anyone know what Chomsky's answer is of what the behaviors are that humans cannot, or humans engage in, that he thinks Skinner just cannot explain by getting rid of the mind? Does anyone know? I'll give you a clue. I'm doing it and have been doing it for the past hour and a quarter. Yeah, it's language. Alan is correct. Chomsky says, what, and this is just like a little background. We have to stop in about a minute, I think. Yeah, we have to stop in a minute. So this will be the last thing, and then I will continue with this in the lecture bit that you're just going to watch on YouTube. But basically what happens is for behaviorism to work, Skinner started with the simple and had to show the same principles applied to the complex. And so what he started to do is try to argue every single sort of behavior could be explained in this way. And so he wrote a book called Verbal Behavior, in which he tried to explain the same principles as are here apply in cases of humans learning to speak. And Chomsky came along and said, no, 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 that doesn't work. Human language is too complicated. And he argued that children could not learn language in this way, and that language, to understand language, you need to understand more and bring the mind back into the picture. So what I'm going to talk about in the little video is just what were his arguments for saying that language was an area in which behavior is not explainable in a behaviorist way. And this was kind of one of the first pushes that really got people to go, oh, behaviorism's deeply flawed. We should go back and bring the mind back into psychology and define psychology as the study of the mind, not as simply as the study of behavior. All right. Does anyone have any, everyone's free to go, but if anyone has any last questions, if you want to stay a little long, I can stick around for a few minutes. Otherwise, you're all free to go. Class is over. Yay. Have a good one, everyone. I hope that was semi-enjoyable. I will see you all next week, and I will be posting this to the YouTube later and be making that other video. Probably it'll go up tomorrow afternoon. So I will talk to you all then, and I will send out emails with what the assignment is and all that stuff. So enjoy the rest of your day. I will see you all tomorrow. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
Professor.
Bye.